the water's fine, homie, jump into the deep end. Sow it, you will reap it. We talking how to start it, how to grow it, how to keep it. Take a deep breath. You are now rocking with Founder Secrets.
Chris Yeung, you're the co-founder of Vimbly. Welcome to Founder Secrets.
Thank you.
What an honor
to be here.
Yeah, so the three of us have known each other for a long time, and it's it's kind of fun seeing an evolution in an entrepreneur's kind of life, right? The Vimbly started as a website, and now it's a holding company that owns kind of all these different businesses. So we'll talk about that, but first we'll start with our icebreaker. So all three of us are going to answer, and the icebreaker is what's a time that something in nature inspired you? I can go first, so you have a little time to think. What's a time that something in nature inspired you in business? So I recently moved to Southern California, and there's a nature reserve near here. So there's a 6-minute walk from our place. And I've started doing these bike rides. So we got a new bike. And yesterday I did a 20-mile bike ride through this nature reserve.
Whoa.
And I realized that I was missing that in my life. When I lived in Kentucky, I would go on these walks through parks. But in New York, I would also do 4-mile walks, but there's not as much nature. Like the walks were through the city, which is, encouraging in its own way and inspiring. But now I realize how much I just love the smells. I love the sounds. I love the lack of cars. There are no cars. And in parts of it are really quiet and along the water. And so it's every bike ride, I have inspiration that comes to me and I take notes. And so it just reminded me of how much I now like that and cherish that. Do you care about nature at all?
Oh, wow. It's a different question. And recently I've been thinking that it's all nature, right? Why is it to say that cars and like metal and steel isn't nature? It's also elements and metal. That's nature too. I think I'd say for me, I read somewhere that there's no straight lines in nature, which I don't know if that's true, but it feels true when I look outside because literally, right, every tree or leaf or flower, I spent a long time looking at a flower with you guys one time. So there are definitely no straight lines that I've seen, which, taking business, it feels like everything we try to do is going to be like super organized and like straight and this and that. And it's got to be very rigid. And whenever things don't work out that way, it's interesting, for me to remember that it's more the natural way of working out is that of not being rigid and straight. So that's what I've taken away from nature.
What about you, Chris?
So this actually reminds me of, you two might have been there as well, certainly. But one thing this reminds me in terms of nature was, I think we were in the Caribbean somewhere, maybe Dominican, and I was woken up by a woodpecker. This is very unusual. So there's no woodpeckers in New York. That's very, very strange. And I just couldn't help but stare at this. And it's like, this woodpecker, what it's doing is it's essentially bashing its head against a tree repeatedly in order to find the little tiny ants or whatever it's like eating inside the tree. I'm like, man, that's a terrible game to play. It's like literally evolved to a place where he on a daily basis goes and smashes his head against a tree so hard that it's like able to wake someone up like many meters or some substantial distance away. And then likewise, I see like, you talk about nature reserve, right? There's like bears out there where, during the salmon season where they reproduce whatever, they swim upstream. And there are some salmon that will literally jump up from the river into the bear's mouth. And I'm like, man, these are two very, very different games in a place where nature is like, and so anyway, this question reminds me about how in business, finding the right opportunity and finding the right game to play is as important, sometimes more important than working really hard or choosing the opportunity where competitive landscape, there's like macro policies, be it whatever it is, there's lots of room for innovation. I want to play the bear game and not.
What an amazing place to start. Also, you said meters, which gives away that the first question, which is why is New York City so much better than Canada, where you came from, for building a business and being an entrepreneur?
Oh man, so can't say anything good about Canada. And I was born and raised in Toronto, in Canada. Love Canada, and I still very much identify, even though I'm kind of identify as American too. But I came down to the U.S. for school, and as we're talking about, I found New York City, and I just haven't looked. So I love New York City. I can't speak firsthand about entrepreneurship in Canada. I know there's a lot of amazing Canadian companies like Shopify, Constellation, these kind of big companies for a while. But to me, the U.S., the size, the concentration of talent, I think is very biased. But having been here for now over half my life, New York here, I also think there's a lot of the ecosystem versus some of the other conversations we've heard of that's pro business. For example, even the U.S. there's no programs, the infrastructure to support entrepreneurship. So I can't say anything bad about elsewhere, but that's certainly what I love most. Some of the things.
That's how he's Canadian. He just won't say anything mean about anybody.
He still doesn't smack down Canada. He said not a negative thing about Canada. It was.
I can't say anything negative about Canada. I still love Canada.
So look, we come across a lot of people, in New York that are in finance and even outside of New York. And it seems like all of them want to be entrepreneurs and want to start companies, and they have money and knowledge, or they come from private equity. They even feel like they've already started and run a business in that realm. Yet very few seem to be able to successfully make that jump. How are you and Sam, but how are you able to do it, and why do you think it's difficult?
Why do I think it's? It certainly was very difficult. I would be the first to admit that without Sam, I don't think I would have. In finance, one of the things, especially where it was a very extreme on risk management and always finding alpha, the greatest risk adjusted from a certain lens. Jumping ship, going and starting a new company from the ground up is probably the worst risk adjusted thing in the world. It's like massive risk, and there's certainly no guarantee of return whatsoever. That was a very difficult thing, but I was motivated by what I just perceived as tremendous opportunity outside of where I was working, and I felt like I wanted to go faster, kind of a financial capacity, but also at that point I was mirroring portfolio analytics. And I was, frustrated at just how slow, like a very large company, I needed to take that chance. It wasn't then. And so between that, the opportunity, and Sam pushing, took a very not risk adjusted.
So I touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but kind of lay out for the audience. So you're working in finance, working on Wall Street, successful, and then started a website. Basically, you started Vimbly.com, an open table for activities. But over time, that evolved and really became more of a holding company. Can you talk about that evolution, or how that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that was important for us is that we didn't want to be heavily diluted. We didn't want to be from one boss to the boss here. And so as we started Vimbly.com, the maybe secret that's cool to share now is that in order to fund the development of it, we were secretly doing consulting on the side to raise cash for one side. Even though ostensibly we were all in on building, the Vimbly.com experience, we were actually a company for the other half. And so the consulting side, which we call Vimbly Webs, or kind of a play on, that we were able to attract, surprisingly big brands. And one part of us kind of thought, like, hey, why is it that we're able to get the attention of huge companies with armies of engineers, armies of staff, and they're engaging in this tiny. So that was the first. The IP, we weren't just kind of doing the execution agency style. We were really trying to build inventive intellectual property that could be used, and also because through this kind of avenue, experience telecom and music and media and financial. It's kind of what set the playbook, in my opinion, about leveraging the IP that we were using, that taking best practice and reapplying. And that's kind of the genesis of the modern day Vimbly, where we invest in and grow via this in tech-enabled.
That's such a key point. I just want to underline, because a lot of companies start these days of like, oh, I'll just have no revenue and just raise money and we'll figure it out. Or here's a new industry that I don't know that much about, but let's start a company and hire some people and go at it, which sounds like the right way. Cause you hear about a lot of people doing that, but I think what you're saying is that's kind of a very bad way, because you can easily end up diluting your equity, losing that money, not getting anywhere, not learning anything in the process. Whereas what you were doing, so much smarter. And so congrats on that. That's awesome. I guess I want to get how many businesses would you say you have under the Vimbly umbrella today?
We have 9 active. And I would say that, on that journey, one of the things I think is very valuable is, I'm clearly biased to bootstrapping method, is that by raising a whole bunch of VC money, I think it kind of de-risks a lot of the downside. And so it's kind of like, hey, let's raise a lot of money, and if you do a great job, like let's go and hit a home run and spend all the money, or we just find another job. As opposed to if we're really doing ourselves, this is our own capital at risk, and really feeling the fire, like I call it the fear, right? Where we're really about to lose our own personal capital and going through that experience. That's kind of a lesson in retrospect.
I mean, I guess I almost think of you guys as a hedge fund. Is that like a wrong way to look at it? Because you are able to like do things. I guess you don't see yourself as that, having worked at a hedge fund. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. One of the cool stories is that we actually did set up, I think you'd call it a hedge fund, mini master setup. It's called Vimbly Commerce. It was the height of 2017, at the end of 2017, where crypto, clarify, I'm not a proponent, don't own crypto, but what I observed, and maybe this is the finance background coming to me, is that it was the end of 2017, you're right. And I noticed that the price of Bitcoin was something like 15,000. So it was something like that in the US. And the price of Bitcoin, Korea, was something like 20,000 US dollars. It was in price in won. And I was like, this is the exact same asset. It's not even a physical asset. It's a digital asset. How could it be possible that exactly the same thing could have been worth 15,000 in the US and 20,000? And this is one of those problems where, like, I guess it's the engineer part of me, the finance part of me, I don't know what it is. I couldn't sleep. Like, I needed to understand why. Because, like, in finance, they always talk about arbitrage. And arbitrage is kind of like unicorn. You don't ever really see a unicorn in real life. There's always a good extra. So I was very motivated to find out why. Why was it there was this discrepancy? And so at the end of the day, we found that there were kind of like capital controls, these sort of things. And what we ended up doing was setting up a hedge fund to essentially work with buy Bitcoin at a low price, ship it to Korea, sell it immediately on the Korean exchange, wire the money back to the US, and cycle it all over.
So why was that? Did the gap close? Like, is the gap zero today?
If the gap is zero today, when people eventually figured it out, and so any examples of arbitrage, the spread eventually goes down. But at some point, it was called the kimchi spread, and people couldn't explain it. It was and it was like the margin was something like 30%. The price of Bitcoin was 30%, and we figured it out. And when we figured it out, it was maybe at like 15%. But at that time, it was a very big deal because you could cycle literally millions of dollars. And there's no inventory. You don't need to ship it. Like, you don't need to fly it over there. You just send it, send it back. And so every single cycle, 15% is a big deal. It compounds. And so to me, that was one of the most exciting. We literally set up a hedge fund.
I mean, that's probably the closest thing that I've ever heard to a money printing, right? Where it's kind of
beautiful while it lasted. And I guess eventually people figured it out, and they replicated the trade. But even until the spread went down from 15%. 5, 4, 3, and up until even it was like a small 1%, we were still doing it because it was you started to go back and forth.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. That you have, I think in college, fair to say.
I don't know. I could say I'm good at poker, but I certainly enjoy it.
That's how you know somebody's good. So do you think that, if a young person is listening to this, do you think that there are skills in poker that are applicable in entrepreneurship? It seems to me that a lot of the entrepreneurs that I know that are really successful also happen to have played poker or are very, very good at poker. Do you think there's any correlation there, or is it just that entrepreneurially minded people happen to be interested?
I did not notice that correlation, yes. Although I do happen to have played poker, I enjoy playing poker. I think that poker is a very applicable entrepreneur. And I don't want to get too negative. I think there's a lot of people that I guess I personally need to deal with that will just lie directly. And being able to have poker or the game Mafia, something with Sam, prospective customers, and they don't mean it. They don't have for example, they don't have a malicious intent. A lot of times you'll go to a sales call and they'll be like, okay, yeah, sounds good. It sounds good. Just send me the information, do a bunch of work. And I know I secretly have no intention of buying anything, but I don't want to be rude, so let's do that. So it's that's one example of poker where it's just very useful to have okay, is this guy in the remote economy too? It even happens with recruitment. There's a number of candidates, especially in this world, where they're kind of like fraudulent, or they're kind of secret chilling at home and trying to represent things. And so I think poker in general has enabled, or at least some sort of alertness and awareness things are not always.
I want to like understand, how are you able to manage? Like, one of the things that people advise in business is to focus on one thing and do it well. And it seems like you guys defy that because you're doing 9 things and you're doing them all well. But how is that even possible, from a time perspective? And yeah.
From a time perspective, well,
Like, if you wake up in the morning, you're like, okay, which of the 9 businesses I'm going to decide to work on? And maybe you're like, oh, I'm going to do this one because I'm interested in it. Okay, so does that mean the other 8 suffer because you are not putting any effort and time towards growing them?
well, I care about all the business, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. The first thing I would say is it's about, I have this process, I call it just cross-biz priorities, not particular. But what I do is I look at all the tasks that, or the things that I need to do, and I simply assign an urgency to each one of them, and I rank order. That's how, and I do that across the businesses, and even sometimes my personal, I to admit that on a podcast, but it's, these things that help me normalize everything at really take a step back and really understand, quantify what makes the most. A book that I really like is Buyback by Martell. One of the things that basically I think a lot about is, but what's the value of my time? And that just happened. There's a lot of books, and if I say, hey, my time was worth X, and this is something higher quarter of that price, then that's the broad threshold. And there's nothing too small that is worth delegating, because death by 1,000, it's very easy for 5-minute tasks the entire day. And so I seek to delegate as much as possible.
Like, take today. Like, what how did you do that today? Like, what did you decide to focus on? Just curious.
What did I decide to focus on today? Well, I've got, so my calendar is a big deal. Every night I make sure I have a good calendar. Today I have a strategy meeting for mobile tech. We have a cool strategy for Perfect Bound, which is publishing software, and to make sure I have time for this podcast. So every night before, I make myself 3 promises that no matter what happens, no matter how many emails, no matter what red alert that comes in tomorrow, I'm going to do these. And those were my 3 that I will, no matter what.
We made the list, Flavio.
We made the top 3. But I wonder, a lot of people I know try to really cut out meetings out of their schedule, and it sounds like your first top 2, this one obviously very much worthwhile, but the other top 2, I'm wondering, the strategy calls, I guess maybe you can elaborate on what it means for you to be a strategist, because it sounds very general. Like, what is a strategy call?
That's a good question. So I think that it's about what I don't like is just regular meetings with a set agenda. It's like a scrum where to go through the same topic. I think they're typically things that can be delegated. One question that drives me is, what is the direction? How are we going to maximize our alpha, our risk-adjusted return, the resources? What are we expecting? And this is always a creative process. I think it's not something where someone can make a template and it's like, oh, here's my update. We just update the spreadsheet. It's a call generally with our team leads, where in general we have team leads for marketing, sales, product development, and customer service. And so it's really kind of a buy-in in the perspective of all the team at the company to really come up and present ideas, share them, and really bat around across all the various functions of the company to arrive at the best. All we need is one good idea, and I encourage everyone to be as honest, brutally retired as much as possible so we can arrive at it. It's one of those things where all ideas are born equal. My say is just as else to say, and best idea wins, which is one of our.
So speaking of core values, something I've learned from you, and I'm expert at it, but something I try to remind myself of, and twice here, is this idea of adjusted return. And I love it, and I incorporate it. I had never heard of that. Maybe it's a finance term, and I don't come from finance, maybe that's why. But can you explain kind of what that is and how do you use it? Because it seems like to me that you use it in your daily, that this idea of like, is this worth it? Or what is a risk-adjusted return, and how could someone else for decision?
And just how do you quantify? Because it sounds like, okay, reduce risk. Everybody wants to reduce risk, but how do you quantify it?
Sure. So what is risk-adjusted return? It's just, for me, it's the way I broadly just think. I've learned the hard way. It's not good to always just focus on the upside. There's always a probability of the upside happening. There's consequences, but it's really my experience to game out all the possible outcomes and the probability, and to maximize the expected value, weighted by all of the things that could happen, and weight that. So let's just say, for example, that I have a $1 million budget, and it's great because someone, the marketing team might say, hey, you know what? There's a possibility that this $1 million is going to generate 500%, in terms of ROAS, in terms of its return on ad spend. And I'm like, okay, well, that's great, but we can't focus on that. It's not just good enough to be like, okay, here's your $1 million because it could happen. We need to have a much better framework to understand what is the possibility of us breaking even? What is the possibility of us totally losing that money in this campaign, falling flat on its face? And I need to quantify that. And quantifying it involves asking why a whole lot of times at a lot of different levels to understand things from first principle, to get to basic, where I can say, based off of things I hold to be true, I can go from that very base layer to the argument is being, if I can't, then I generally am just not as comfortable, and I'll know that I don't need, and I'll need to ask them. And that's why on certain topics, I do feel grounded and confident. One of the useful things about this is also that I know what I don't know. When I'm not able to understand, hey, what is the impact or the probability of the downside? I know at that point that I just don't know enough, and I need to ask more questions before, and I need to have more information, interview other people before I can really confidently.
When you think about that example, which I think that's a really good example. So let's say it's $1 million, and I come from a marketing background, and I totally hear, because everybody in marketing at the beginning of a campaign focuses on the upside. To your point, everybody is, this is
every
going to
single
work.
person is going to tell you
this
that
will
the $1
work.
million is going to be more than $1 million tomorrow.
Totally. And it seems to me that you come from a principle of, well, what are the chances that $1 million comes zero? What's the chance that becomes 100,000? Is that the way you view it? It's literally kind of in that, and then you assign percentages to each of those. Like, how do you actually do something like that? And
I see. Well, so I'll try and decompose or dissect how we're going to spend $1 million to as much of my depth of my knowledge as possible. So I'm going to ask, how are we going to spend? Can we dissect each one of them? And can we understand the volatility of the range of outcomes of each one of those steps? And to identify that level of distribution as low level as there are some certain things very, very high knowing will happen. For example, if we have this one campaign that has been converting at between 18 and 20% for the last 2 years, that gives me a very, very high confidence that we're going to land at. There's a chance, a very small chance, of distribution of us returning less than 8. But I'm pretty much going to expect it. But if there's some things where we don't have enough data, or the results are all over the place, where it's we have a 5% one month, 50% another. I know that the volatility, the variance in mathematical terms is going to be very, very wide, and so it's very hard for me to say, for any one person to say, okay, I'm going to expect this, because the expectation of any one particular number is so slim that it's not worth putting weight in. And when I encounter those scenarios, I need to decompose that one item into more logical steps with greater certainty, in order to really arrive at that. That makes sense.
Well, it sounds like you got to test it, right? Because in all those examples, it seems like you run it for a little while with maybe less money, and then based on the results, you start increasing or extrapolating. Fair?
Right. And in general, every time I make a decision, I just, there's something in my brain, I just think of it as, right? Like, here's something even much, much more basic. Be like, hey, be with my wife a lot of times, and be like, hey, we have a dinner party downtown. We should like take the train 7:10, and for her, it's like a lot of times she's like, well, in my experience, it's about 20 minutes, and we said, wait, let's go. In my mind, it's kind of like, well, we could take the subway or take the car, or take this thing. Take the subway, then there's like a 0 to 3 mid distribution that we're going to have to transfer at Union Square, and there's going to be this volatility of that, and because of this, and because like we might hit a red light, like there's going to be like a 0 to 6%, 6 whatever minute variance, and how we're going to get there. If we take the car, there's going to be traffic, and there's a distribution there, and like I always come to the same conclusion. We should take the train at 7:10. And it kills me sometimes, but it's just kind of how I map out and game out the outcome.
You are like quantum mechanics in a human being, It's like an electron. You can't be in any one place at once. It's always a probability of Chris being somewhere. But I'd say, to push back against that, even though, I mean, it sounds very effective. I'm wondering, do you kind of miss out maybe on like the experience of, say, enjoying this trip or kind of enjoying the journey? How do you factor that into what seems like a very probabilistic mathematical mental model?
This is true. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. When things like this, and I kind of game this all the ways out. We could go downtown for dinner. I do get lost in the process. I also kind of think that's kind of the game I'd like to play. Otherwise, I'm doing it so much. It's just the thing that I do, the way I think.
So what do you do, I guess, when you notice, what do you do to enjoy the process more? Do you have like tips for toning it down, or what do you do?
Well, first of all, I enjoy it when the thought process works and we take a different action than what we would have otherwise done, and I see the results for it. Again, like give me some satisfaction. I do try to make a point to smell the roses, while I can.
The business has evolved. We talked about kind of the business model, and you have these different business units. How do you view, right? Because as you've talked about, I imagine early on in the business when you had the Vimbly web services, like you were probably doing a lot of the engineering work, and you maybe had a small team. But over time, the business has become much more complex, and you can't do all the work. I mean, you've talked about delegating and finding. So how do you view like leadership, or how do you kind of the growth of your role as the business has evolved? How do you kind of think of those things, and where do you look for?
Well, for me, the biggest, I guess, change is pretty good, inspiring. But one of the lessons that I've learned the hard way, teamwork. I guess in my prior life, there was a lot of competition about like being to stand out as an all-star. And through the years, I've just grown much the ability for work together. Some is greater than some of the parts type of is one thing I care. I now have the firm belief that the greatest sins of mankind have been done through cooperation and teamwork. And that's one thing. I think the second thing is it that what makes you want to wake up and play your A game every single day. And there's this one thing that Sam and I have talked about over the years. It's called RIG, relationships, impact. I think that if we have these three things in your career, you'll have a fulfilling, satisfying journey. Money, by the way, is very much. I think that if in your job you develop meaningful relations within work, that you're really making something and you are growing personally in terms of soft skill, communication, professionally. This is an ongoing game. I think that, and that means like, I did RIG this year and call it a day. It's something to continue investing in. This is kind of my North Star in how I approach leadership, recruiting, and really elevating the next class of leaders.
I love that. So as we kind of wrap here, you have a very exciting opportunity. We may have to cut this in post-production if it's not allowed to be said out loud. But you have this very exciting opportunity with Perfect Bound in a space, publishing, that I think a lot of entrepreneurs maybe think of as dead or dying or not exciting or not interesting. And you're going kind of full bore into it, and opportunity that you may or may not be able to say out loud. So what is Perfect Bound, and why are you so excited about it?
So this goes back to BWS. We talk about building our IP and leveraging it elsewhere. And this was an opportunity that came about having met the owner of a mid-sized independent publishing firm that's based in. And it turns out that publishing is in some ways one of the latest adopters. It's kind of a stereotype. You have literally companies that have been operating for hundreds, like we'll do this. I've been running this for generations. I don't need the internet or whatever, right? And I come in and we're like, well, what technology has been able to add value and drive operational space. So one example here is that many publishers have a single printer, basically the manufacturer of books, for example, that they deal with. He's my guy that I go with. And one observation here is like, well, we could kind of take the Uber model where we're going to engage 60 printers across the globe, and you can print locally wherever you go. So you go from day one, where historically, where you have maybe one printer in America, you print all your books there, and then you slow boat it. You send it through plane, or you spend a month shipping it by sea, do the customs, do the tax, do the shipping, logistics, right? Or you can say, hey, let's leverage a network of printers. All 60 printers across the globe are going to print locally. You're not going to have to ship anywhere far, have no customs rules, nothing like that, and you're going to drive massive cost saving you're going to be driving new business to these printers, and you're going to have that's kind of from the manufacturing point. From the distribution point, from the sales point of view, we have the same type of opportunity where, because what we can do is essentially be the one aggregator, the one central that massive distributors focus on. And we will focus, as a result, we will do the customer service, and we'll basically provide the service to all the independent little publishers. And in doing so, enable small publishers, maybe first-time publishers, that would otherwise have no chance of selling their book in Barnes & Noble's, let alone one in Indonesia somewhere, and all of a sudden be able to provide and expand the market. And so I'm really excited about Perfect Bound. Number one, it had tremendous efficiency to incumbents. Number two, opens up entirely new greenfield opportunity that didn't exist before. It's not a zero-sum game. And so some players are taking space, some of the largest distributors in the world, frankly. And so it's a very exciting time.
Where can people find out more about Perfect Bound?
So you can go to, just check out Perfect Bound at just perfectbound.io.
So if I
tell you all what we're about, and if we're doing our job well, you'll be able to understand what we do in 2 minutes or less.
So if I get a book, would I know it's from Perfect Bound done, or would it still show up as like, Penguin or Random House or whatever on it?
It will show up as published by Perfect. It will be distributed by
really?
Simon Schuster, Penguin Random House. It will be published
That's
by,
so cool.
and these distributors will be our imprints. It will be an imprint of.
Wow. That's awesome. Well, look, we're going for hours, so might have to have you back here to go through the other 8 businesses. And moving on to this life hack, which is what's a hack that maybe made an impact on your life recently. I'll go first, and then Taylor, and end with you, Chris.
A life hack?
Yeah, any sort of hack, a life hack, something that's made, a tip that's made your life better in some way. All right, sticking with the Perfect Bound sort of literature, I've been trying to read. There's a few big books that I've tried to read for ever since I was in college. I was like, I'm going to read this book one day, like Infinite Jest, and Thomas Pynchon has a book. Anyway, they're super long and super difficult to read, and just never could make it past 50 pages. But then I discovered this Patreon called Hardcore Literature Book Club, where this genius guy, Benjamin McEnvoy, just does these videos where it makes it so easy and digestible and accessible, where you read a part of the book and then you listen to his video, and then he kind of tells you what it all means very quickly, and just made the process so much enjoyable. I do the Audible and the book. And anyway, now I've finished one of those big books that I've always wanted to read. So I highly recommend it.
Wow. So I recently got a dog, and so that will be my life hack, but not this wake her up. So I will do it when I can show it in camera. My hack is going to be, there's a newsletter. Newsletter is the name of my new company. we changed the name from Signal Insights to Newsletter, but there's a newsletter that I pay for, which is like I feel like if I pay,
you pay for an email.
I pay for an email. I pay for a Substack. It's called News Items with John Ellis. It's a daily email. It comes out every morning at 6. And it was, I found out about it because who's the guy that writes Fred? He writes avc.com. Fred Wilson. So Fred Wilson said that it was the #1 newsletter. I've been reading it for like 5 years. So I signed up for it. Sight unseen. It's $10 a month. What it is, it's written by one guy. It's written by this guy, John Ellis. And every day he writes bullet points of things going on in the news that I would have never heard about otherwise. So let me give an example. I'm just going to read like this morning's, just read the headlines. There's a saying that economic expansions don't die of old age. They're murdered by the Federal Reserve. So that's the #1 kind of leading story. Number 2 is the U.S. economy added far fewer jobs in 2023 and early 2024 than previously reported. Then number 3 is Canada's 2 main railroads earlier today locked out over 9,000 employees. And then he talks a lot about China in a way that I don't hear about. So number 4 is mainland China's distressed developers are issuing a steady string of loss warnings for the first half of the year. Number 5 is Chinese banks have committed 1.4 trillion won in loans to support more than 5,000 real estate projects. So what I do is I just kind of skim this. It's like starts with the U.S., but a lot of it's outside the states, and it's very impartial. It's just kind of stating the facts, and I like it a lot because I can skim it. I don't have to click on any of the links, and I feel like He also, the last thing I'll say is that he talks a lot about research. So number 9 is researchers have found that a shocking amount of microplastics are ending up in our brains. Not all of them are bad like that. Some of them are really hopeful, good research. But yeah, that's my hack. It's called News Items by John Ellis. It's just like a month-to-month Substack, but it is like...
I'm going to write that down. I spend probably more catching up with the news than I care to, just keeping up with what's going on. I spend about an hour probably every single day reading Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the various tech blogs. Okay, you inspired the life hack that I think has made the impact my life, which is a book, Atomic Habit by James Clear. And the one thing that I learned is what he talks about is the 2-minute rule, where you can do anything. And if you do the thing for 2 minutes, you'll eventually be able to learn a new language, play a new instrument. For me, it was, or not to, and it was through this one tenet, 2-minute rule, doing it every day or not doing it, and stacking habit that quit smoking. Famously and the results of that to eventually run a marathon, which if you knew me in my 20s, and so, when I really want to really long-term kind of go back to the core strategy.
That's great.
Yeah. Chris, thank you for coming on Founder Secrets.
What an honor to have you on and to be one of the top 3 things today. Appreciate you, brother.
Oh, it's super fun. It was always great seeing you guys.
Where can people find you? If they can reach out to you.
Or reach out either chris@vimbly.com or all right. Thanks so much.
Later.
Thank you for rocking with the homies. Taylor, Trusty, and Flavio. Seize the day, own it. Until next time, hold it down, hold it down. Hey.